working rules for the formulation of linear programming problems. So now before solving we have to formulate the problems. How to formulate? Let's go step by step. Now step number 1. Step number 1 is identify the decision variable. Identify the decision variables. And what are the decision variables? Identify the decision variables in the problem. Now what are the decision variables? Let me tell you. These are those quantities whose values we wish to determine. Identify the decision variables, and decision variables I have mentioned in the red. It is those quantities whose values we wish to determine, and assign them and assign symbols to them, and assign symbols x and y to them. So this is the very first step. Identify the decision variable. Decision variables are those quantities whose values we wish to determine, and assign them symbols x and y to them. Okay. Now step number 2. Identify all the constants we have already defined constants. Okay, so identify all the constants and express them as linear inequations oblique so identify all the constants and express them as a linear inequations or equations in terms of decision variables. So these are the 2 steps. First of all, we are going to give symbols x and y for the decision variables, and then we are calculating, or we are just finding all the constants. Okay. Now step 3. Identify. Now major thing which we have to identify is the objective function. Identify the objective function and express it as a linear function of decision variable. Now just a tip for you, okay, identify the objective function and express it as a linear function of the decision variable. Now objective function already we have defined objective function, okay. So objective function might take the form of maximize profit or production, maximize profit or production, or minimize production or minimize cost, etc. Depends on the question. Now step number 4. Now we have to, what we have to, we have find it the objective function, we have find it the constants. On the beginning we have find it the decision variables. Now we are left with add the non-negativity, restrictions on the decision variable as the physical problem add the negativity restrictions on the decision variable as the physical problem, negative value now of decision variable have no valid interpretation. So these are the 4 basic steps by which we are going to formulate the linear programming problem.